Chapter 9. Having put on French greatcoats and shakos, Petya and Dólokhov rode to the clearing from which Denísov had reconnoitered the French camp, and emerging from the forest in pitch darkness they descended into the hollow. On reaching the bottom, Dólokhov told the Cossacks accompanying him to await him there and rode on at a quick trot along the road to the bridge. Petya, his heart in his mouth with excitement, rode by his side. "If we're caught, I won't be taken alive. I have a pistol," whispered he. "Don't talk Russian," said Dólokhov in a hurried whisper, and at that very moment they heard through the darkness the challenge, "Kavive?" Asterisk and the click of a musket. Asterisk, who goes there? The blood rushed to Petya's face and he grasped his pistol. "Lanciers do 6 me," asterisk replied Dólokhov, neither hastening nor slackening his horse's pace. Asterisk, Lancers of the 6th Regiment. The black figure of a sentinel stood on the bridge. Mot d'ordre. Asterisk. Asterisk, password. Dólokhov reined in his horse and advanced at a walk. "Dites donc, le Colonel Gérard est ici?" Asterisk he asked. Asterisk, tell me, is Colonel Gérard here? Mot d'ordre, repeated the sentinel, barring the way and not replying. Quand un officier fait sa ronde, les sentinelles ne demandent pas le mot d'ordre, cried Dólokhov suddenly flaring up and riding straight at the sentinel. Je vous demande si le Colonel est ici? Asterisk. Asterisk, when an officer is making his round, sentinels don't ask him for the password. I am asking you if the Colonel is here. And without waiting for an answer from the sentinel, who had stepped aside, Dólokhov rode up the incline at a walk. Noticing the black outline of a man crossing the road, Dólokhov stopped him and inquired where the commander and officers were. The man, a soldier with a sack over his shoulder, stopped, came close up to Dólokhov's horse, touched it with his hand, and explained simply and in a friendly way that the commander and the officers were higher up the hill to the right in the courtyard of the farm, as he called the landowner's house. Having ridden up the road, on both sides of which French talk could be heard around the campfires, Dólokhov turned into the courtyard of the landowner's house. Having ridden in, he dismounted and approached a big blazing campfire, around which sat several men talking noisily. Something was boiling in a small cauldron at the edge of the fire and a soldier in a peaked cap and blue overcoat, lit up by the fire, was kneeling beside it stirring its contents with a ramrod. "Oh, he's a hard nut to crack," said one of the officers who was sitting in the shadow at the other side of the fire. "He'll make them get a move on, those fellows," said another, laughing. Both fell silent, peering out through the darkness at the sound of Dólokhov's and Petya's steps as they advanced to the fire leading their horses. "Bonjour, messieurs." Asterisk said Dólokhov loudly and clearly. Asterisk, good day, gentlemen. There was a stir among the officers in the shadow beyond the fire, and one tall, long-necked officer, walking round the fire, came up to Dólokhov. "Is that you, Clement?" he asked. "Where the devil?" But, noticing his mistake, he broke off short and, with a frown, greeted Dólokhov as a stranger, asking what he could do for him. Dólokhov said that he and his companion were trying to overtake their regiment, and addressing the company in general asked whether they knew anything of the 6th Regiment. None of them knew anything, and Petya thought the officers were beginning to look at him and Dólokhov with hostility and suspicion. For some seconds all were silent. "If you were counting on the evening soup, you have come too late," said a voice from behind the fire with a repressed laugh. Dólokhov replied that they were not hungry and must push on farther that night. He handed the horses over to the soldier who was stirring the pot and squatted down on his heels by the fire beside the officer with the long neck. That officer did not take his eyes from Dólokhov and again asked to what regiment he belonged. Dólokhov, as if he had not heard the question, did not reply, but lighting a short French pipe which he took from his pocket began asking the officer in how far the road before them was safe from Cossacks. "Those brigands are everywhere," replied an officer from behind the fire. Dólokhov remarked that the Cossacks were a danger only to stragglers such as his companion and himself, but probably they would not dare to attack large detachments, he added inquiringly. No one replied. "Well, now he'll come away," Petya thought every moment as he stood by the campfire listening to the talk. But Dólokhov restarted the conversation which had dropped and began putting direct questions as to how many men there were in the battalion, how many battalions, and how many prisoners. Asking about the Russian prisoners with that detachment, Dólokhov said. A horrid business dragging these corpses about with one. It would be better to shoot such rabble, and burst into loud laughter, so strange that Petya thought the French would immediately detect their disguise, and involuntarily took a step back from the campfire. No one replied a word to Dólokhov's laughter, and a French officer whom they could not see, he lay wrapped in a greatcoat, rose and whispered something to a companion. Dólokhov got up and called to the soldier who was holding their horses. Will they bring our horses or not, thought Petya, instinctively drawing nearer to Dólokhov. The horses were brought. Good evening, gentlemen, said Dólokhov. Petya wished to say, good night, but could not utter a word. The officers were whispering together. Dólokhov was a long time mounting his horse which would not stand still, then he rode out of the yard at a foot-pace. Petya rode beside him, longing to look round to see whether or not the French were running after them, but not daring to. Coming out onto the road, Dólokhov did not ride back across the open country, but through the village. At one spot he stopped and listened. Do you hear? He asked. Petya recognized the sound of Russian voices and saw the dark figures of Russian prisoners round their campfires. When they had descended to the bridge, Petya and Dólokhov rode past the sentinel, who without saying a word paced morosely up and down it, then they descended into the hollow where the Cossacks awaited them. Well now, goodbye. Tell Denísov at the first shot at daybreak, said Dólokhov, and was about to ride away, but Petya seized hold of him. Really, he cried, you are such a hero. Oh, how fine, how splendid. How I love you. All right, said Dólokhov. But Petya did not let go of him, and Dólokhov saw through the gloom that Petya was bending toward him and wanted to kiss him. Dólokhov kissed him, laughed, turned his horse, and vanished into the darkness. Chapter 10. Having returned to the watchman's hut, Petya found Denísov in the passage. He was awaiting Petya's return in a state of agitation, anxiety, and self-reproach for having let him go. Thank God, he exclaimed. Yes, thank God, he repeated, listening to Petya's rapturous account. But, devil take you, I haven't slept because of you. Well, thank God. Now lie down. We can still get a nap before morning. But, no, said Petya, I don't want to sleep yet. Besides, I know myself, if I fall asleep it's finished. And then I am used to not sleeping before a battle. He sat a while in the hut, joyfully recalling the details of his expedition and vividly picturing to himself what would happen next day. Then, noticing that Denísov was asleep, he rose and went out of doors. It was still quite dark outside. The rain was over, but drops were still falling from the trees. Near the watchman's hut the black shapes of the Cossacks' shanties and of horses tethered together could be seen. Behind the hut the dark shapes of the two wagons with their horses beside them were discernible, and in the hollow the dying campfire gleamed red. Not all the Cossacks and hussars were asleep. Here and there, amid the sounds of falling drops and the munching of the horses nearby, could be heard low voices which seemed to be whispering. Petya came out, peered into the darkness, and went up to the wagons. Someone was snoring under them, and around them stood saddled horses munching their oats. In the dark Petya recognized his own horse, which he called Karabagh, though it was of Ukrainian breed, and went up to it. Well, Karabagh. We'll do some service tomorrow, said he, sniffing its nostrils and kissing it. Why aren't you asleep, sir, said a Cossack who was sitting under a wagon. No, Likhachև, isn't that your name? Do you know I have only just come back? We've been into the French camp. And Petya gave the Cossack a detailed account not only of his ride but also of his object, and why he considered it better to risk his life than to act, just anyhow. Well, you should get some sleep now, said the Cossack. No, I am used to this, said Petya. I say, aren't the flints in your pistols worn out? I brought some with me. Don't you want any? You can have some. The Cossack bent forward from under the wagon to get a closer look at Petya. Because I am accustomed to doing everything accurately, said Petya. Some fellows do things just anyhow, without preparation, and then they're sorry for it afterwards. I don't like that. Just so, said the Cossack. Oh yes, another thing. Please, my dear fellow, will you sharpen my saber for me? It's got BL. Petya feared to tell a lie, and the saber never had been sharpened. Can you do it? Of course I can. Likichev got up, rummaged in his pack, and soon Petya heard the warlike sound of steel on whetstone. He climbed onto the wagon and sat on its edge. The Cossack was sharpening the saber under the wagon. I say. Are the lads asleep? Asked Petya. Some are, and some aren't, like us. Well, and that boy? Veseny. Oh, he's thrown himself down there in the passage. Fast asleep after his fright. He was that glad. After that Petya remained silent for a long time, listening to the sounds. He heard footsteps in the darkness and a black figure appeared. What are you sharpening? Asked a man coming up to the wagon. Why, this gentleman's saber. That's right, said the man, whom Petya took to be an hussar. Was the cup left here? There, by the wheel. The hussar took the cup. It must be daylight soon, said he, yawning, and went away. Petya ought to have known that he was in a forest with Denisov's guerrilla band, less than a mile from the road, sitting on a wagon captured from the French beside which horses were tethered, that under it Likichev was sitting sharpening a saber for him, that the big dark blotch to the right was the watchman's hut, and the red blotch below to the left was the dying embers of a campfire, that the man who had come for the cup was an hussar who wanted a drink, but he neither knew nor waited to know anything of all this. He was in a fairy kingdom where nothing resembled reality. The big dark blotch might really be the watchman's hut, or it might be a cavern leading to the very depths of the earth. Perhaps the red spot was a fire, or it might be the eye of an enormous monster. Perhaps he was really sitting on a wagon, but it might very well be that he was not sitting on a wagon but on a terribly high tower from which, if he fell, he would have to fall for a whole day or a whole month, or go on falling and never reach the bottom. Perhaps it was just the Cossack, Likichev, who was sitting under the wagon, but it might be the kindest, bravest, most wonderful, most splendid man in the world, whom no one knew of. It might really have been that the hussar came for water and went back into the hollow, but perhaps he had simply vanished, disappeared altogether and dissolved into nothingness. Nothing Petya could have seen now would have surprised him. He was in a fairy kingdom where everything was possible. He looked up at the sky. And the sky was a fairy realm like the earth. It was clearing, and over the tops of the trees clouds were swiftly sailing as if unveiling the stars. Sometimes it looked as if the clouds were passing, and a clear black sky appeared. Sometimes it seemed as if the black spaces were clouds. Sometimes the sky seemed to be rising high, high overhead, and then it seemed to sink so low that one could touch it with one's hand. Petya's eyes began to close and he swayed a little. The trees were dripping. Quiet talking was heard. The horses neighed and jostled one another. Someone snored. Ozheg, hissed the saber against the whetstone, and suddenly Petya heard an harmonious orchestra playing some unknown, sweetly solemn hymn. Petya was as musical as Natasha and more so than Nicholas, but had never learned music or thought about it, and so the melody that unexpectedly came to his mind seemed to him particularly fresh and attractive. The music became more and more audible. The melody grew and passed from one instrument to another. And what was played was a fugue, though Petya had not the least conception of what a fugue is. Each instrument, now resembling a violin and now a horn, but better and clearer than violin or horn, played its own part, and before it had finished the melody merged with another instrument that began almost the same air, and then with a third and a fourth, and they all blended into one and again became separate and again blended, now into solemn church music, now into something dazzlingly brilliant and triumphant. Oh, why, that was in a dream. Petya said to himself, as he lurched forward. It's in my ears. But perhaps it's music of my own. Well, go on, my music. Now. He closed his eyes, and, from all sides as if from a distance, sounds fluttered, grew into harmonies, separated, blended, and again all mingled into the same sweet and solemn hymn. Oh, this is delightful. As much as I like and as I like, said Petya to himself. He tried to conduct that enormous orchestra. Now softly, softly die away, and the sounds obeyed him. Now fuller, more joyful. Still more and more joyful. And from an unknown depth rose increasingly triumphant sounds. Now voices join in, ordered Petya. And at first from afar he heard men's voices and then women's. The voices grew in harmonious triumphant strength, and Petya listened to their surpassing beauty in awe and joy. With a solemn triumphal march there mingled a song, the drip from the trees, and the hissing of the saber, ozheg-zeg-zeg, and again the horses jostled one another and neighed, not disturbing the choir but joining in it. Petya did not know how long this lasted. He enjoyed himself all the time, wondered at his enjoyment and regretted that there was no one to share it. He was awakened by Likachev's kindly voice. It's ready, Your Honor, you can split a Frenchman in half with it. Petya woke up. It's getting light, it's really getting light, he exclaimed. The horses that had previously been invisible could now be seen to their very tails, and a watery light showed itself through the bare branches. Petya shook himself, jumped up, took a ruble from his pocket and gave it to Likachev, then he flourished the saber, tested it, and sheathed it. The Cossacks were untying their horses and tightening their saddle girths. And here's the commander, said Likachev. Denisov came out of the watchman's hut and, having called Petya, gave orders to get ready. Chapter 11. The men rapidly picked out their horses in the semi-darkness, tightened their saddle girths, and formed companies. Denisov stood by the watchman's hut giving final orders. The infantry of the detachment passed along the road and quickly disappeared amid the trees in the mist of early dawn, hundreds of feet splashing through the mud. The Isal gave some orders to his men. Petya held his horse by the bridle, impatiently awaiting the order to mount. His face, having been bathed in cold water, was all aglow, and his eyes were particularly brilliant. Cold shivers ran down his spine and his whole body pulsed rhythmically. Well, is everything ready? Asked Denisov. Bring the horses. The horses were brought. Denisov was angry with the Cossack because the saddle girths were too slack, reproved him, and mounted. Petya put his foot in the stirrup. His horse by habit made as if to nip his leg, but Petya leaped quickly into the saddle unconscious of his own weight and, turning to look at the hussars starting in the darkness behind him, rode up to Denisov. Vasily Dmitrich, entrust me with some commission. Please, for God's sake, said he. Denisov seemed to have forgotten Petya's very existence. He turned to glance at him. I ask one thing of you, he said sternly, to obey me and not shove yourself forward anywhere. He did not say another word to Petya but rode in silence all the way. When they had come to the edge of the forest it was noticeably growing light over the field. Denisov talked in whispers with the Isal and the Cossacks rode past Petya and Denisov. When they had all ridden by, Denisov touched his horse and rode down the hill. Slipping onto their haunches and sliding, the horses descended with their riders into the ravine. Petya rode beside Denisov, the pulsation of his body constantly increasing. It was getting lighter and lighter, but the mist still hid distant objects. Having reached the valley, Denisov looked back and nodded to a Cossack beside him. The signal, said he. The Cossack raised his arm and a shot rang out. In an instant the tramp of horses galloping forward was heard, shouts came from various sides, and then more shots. At the first sound of trampling hoofs and shouting, Petya lashed his horse and loosening his rein galloped forward, not heeding Denisov who shouted at him. It seemed to Petya that at the moment the shot was fired it suddenly became as bright as noon. He galloped to the bridge. Cossacks were galloping along the road in front of him. On the bridge he collided with a Cossack who had fallen behind, but he galloped on. In front of him soldiers, probably Frenchmen, were running from right to left across the road. One of them fell in the mud under his horse's feet. Cossacks were crowding about a hut, busy with something. From the midst of that crowd terrible screams arose. Petya galloped up, and the first thing he saw was the pale face and trembling jaw of a Frenchman, clutching the handle of a lance that had been aimed at him. "Hurrah! Lads! Ours!" shouted Petya, and giving rein to his excited horse he galloped forward along the village street. He could hear shooting ahead of him. Cossacks, hussars, and ragged Russian prisoners, who had come running from both sides of the road, were shouting something loudly and incoherently. A gallant-looking Frenchman, in a blue overcoat, capless, and with a frowning red face, had been defending himself against the hussars. When Petya galloped up, the Frenchman had already fallen. "Too late again," flashed through Petya's mind, and he galloped on to the place from which the rapid firing could be heard. The shots came from the yard of the landowner's house he had visited the night before with Dólokhov. The French were making a stand there behind a wattle fence in a garden thickly overgrown with bushes and were firing at the Cossacks who crowded at the gateway. Through the smoke, as he approached the gate, Petya saw Dólokhov, whose face was of a pale greenish tint, shouting to his men. "Go round. Wait for the infantry," he exclaimed as Petya rode up to him. "Wait." "Hurrah!" shouted Petya, and without pausing a moment galloped to the place whence came the sounds of firing and where the smoke was thickest. A volley was heard, and some bullets whistled past, while others plashed against something. The Cossacks and Dólokhov galloped after Petya into the gateway of the courtyard. In the dense wavering smoke some of the French threw down their arms and ran out of the bushes to meet the Cossacks, while others ran down the hill toward the pond. Petya was galloping along the courtyard, but instead of holding the reins he waved both his arms about rapidly and strangely, slipping farther and farther to one side in his saddle. His horse, having galloped up to a campfire that was smoldering in the morning light, stopped suddenly, and Petya fell heavily onto the wet ground. The Cossack saw that his arms and legs jerked rapidly though his head was quite motionless. A bullet had pierced his skull. After speaking to the senior French officer, who came out of the house with a white handkerchief tied to his sword and announced that they surrendered, Dólokhov dismounted and went up to Petya, who lay motionless with outstretched arms. "Done for," he said with a frown, and went to the gate to meet Denísov, who was riding toward him. "Killed," cried Denísov, recognizing from a distance the unmistakably lifeless attitude, very familiar to him, in which Petya's body was lying. "Done for," repeated Dólokhov as if the utterance of these words afforded him pleasure, and he went quickly up to the prisoners, who were surrounded by Cossacks who had hurried up. "We won't take them," he called out to Denísov. Denísov did not reply. He rode up to Petya, dismounted, and with trembling hands turned toward himself the blood-stained, mud-bespattered face which had already gone white. "I am used to something sweet. Raisins, fine ones, take them all," he recalled Petya's words. And the Cossacks looked round in surprise at the sound, like the yelp of a dog, with which Denísov turned away, walked to the wattle fence, and seized hold of it. Among the Russian prisoners rescued by Denísov and Dólokhov was Pierre Bezúkhov.